like to begin with a little disclaimer that I'm not a physician. As well, I'm not a biochemist. I'm not a researcher. In fact, I don't have any degree. That being said, um, I do consider myself to be relatively scientifically literate, and hopefully, any questions or comments that you may have, you'll be sure to write them down and share them with everybody. Um, that being said, a lot of this is speculation. A lot of this is inference. Unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of available long-term research within many of the topics I will discuss. So hopefully this will help you make a more informed decision with regards to your health, and also uh, help bring about a greater understanding of what technologies are being used here. Um, that being said, this is not medical advice. So, again, you should uh, seek a professional for those things. Thank you. So, about the vaccines, you hear a lot of talk about what they do. They never really go into any detail, which I find somewhat alarming. Typically, I support vaccination programs. I do believe in modern medicine. Um, I believe vaccines are important. That's how we beat polio and other nasties. But this is new and emerging technology, and they haven't really given us much detail as to how they intend to make this therapeutic immunize you against the C word. Now, they did say it makes your body, makes your cells produce the S spike protein within your cells. So you have endogenous creation, synthesis of the S protein. And this should be hypothetically a ubiquitous expression throughout your cells. And it does this through messenger RNA. So the idea is that you've got RNA, which flows around in your cell, and you could think of it like, those old punch ribbons, something like that. And what this mRNA product does is it grabs a hold of your punch ribbon and finds the spot that it's supposed to go to, and it injects an extra snippet of punch ribbon. From there, the RNA goes into its, where it's supposed to go, which typically that ends up being, transcribed as DNA, one way or another. It depends. RNA is a complicated topic and a complicated matter. Very often we're told that RNA is basically single-stranded DNA, and it's not entirely the full story. Now, I'm not gonna pass myself off as some sort of RNA expert, but I know some things. There has to be. I feel this is what I find personally alarming is that there must be somebody better than me at this. Um, so you have your RNA, which forces the cell to produce the spike protein. Okay. And then there's they say that there's the possibility of immune responses to the spike protein, and that means that it's working. So they say. You know, who is Salon.com? Sorry, do they have PhD geneticists working at Salon.com or CNN? I'd like to know. I'd like to know their sources. Their doctor friend told them their doctors don't know these things. Nurses don't know these things. Most doctors, anyway. And the thing is that this is an evolution in medicine. So we're not dealing with a simple vaccine, a viral vector vaccine, attenuated vaccine, attenuated viral vector. What we're dealing with is an injection which, as it would seem, interferes with what are called G-quadruplexes. Now, the vaccine does it, and the spike protein does it. Which, that's not something you want. So G-quadruplexes, or guanine quadruplexes, are four-stranded DNA, much like RNA is single-stranded. Well, G-quadruplexes are quad-stranded DNA. And there are other states, forms of DNA out there. It's not so much quad-stranded DNA rather than a specific region of the DNA that ends up having four guanine molecules in a specific form, and then they produce a lattice. So not only is it four-stranded, but it goes it stacks upon itself. So this is fairly new research. Not much has been done in the field of understanding four-stranded DNA. It was discovered a while ago. It was theorized a while ago as well. The real thing about it is that it was only in the more recent years that they've started really pushing research into this intercellular phenomenon. Now, what's so special about G-quadruplexes, also known as G4s? Quite a few things. Correlation doesn't mean causation, but as it would seem, a lot of cancerous cells tend to exhibit a high degree of G4s. And the jury's out as to why. Okay, well, what do we know about G4s? We know that G4s like to show up in the telomeres. Now, for those uninitiated, telomeres are the end caps of your chromosomes. As you age, they get shorter. You can get them back, so it is reversible to some degree. Often it's been considered like the end caps of shoelaces, and it helps with stability of the whole strand. Of course, as your cells replicate, it's kind of like faxing a fax. So your telomeres get shorter, and it turns out that, as they get shorter, so does your lifespan. And also the health of your cells. You end up with more senescent cells as they get shorter. And it's both correlated and causated, but it's reciprocal. And things like proper diet and exercise can actually lengthen your telomeres. In fact, there are certain chemical compounds that were researched which lengthened telomeres. TA65 is a good example. Although there are naturally occurring substances that will do this as well with different results. And we can speculate as to why the results are different than this sort of chemical option. So in the natural world, you'll have substances such as astragalus, which will lengthen telomeres as well as other, biological effects. I haven't done any research with regards to G4s and astragalus, but I assume that there would be some sort of interactions here. However, I did do some research regarding certain small molecules, and by research is probably not the right word for it. Data interpretation. I don't own a lab. So whenever I tell somebody something with regards to these things, I say, hey, look, I don't have a lab, so I didn't do my own research. But, do your reading, do your due diligence, and come up with a reasonable hypothesis. So, resveratrol appears to stabilize G4s. Fascinating. Okay, and it also lengthens telomeres. Also fascinating. And other stilbenoids will also have similar effects. Now, stilbenoids specifically, you kind of have to watch out for in the case of, like pterostilbene and a few others. Resveratrol is very safe, but the others may have cardiovascular implications in rare cases. Specific individuals may have negative reactions, which I don't think that the sample size, or I don't think it was a large enough issue that they ever released warning labels with regards to pterostilbene or any kind of washing. But that is a thing. So we know that resveratrol has these effects, and apparently, both in vitro and in vivo, also has promising effects with regards to the C word, but also its other siblings, the M word, MERS, or Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. And it's also antiviral, and to some degree, it's not a chemical option as I would say, but it is quite a potent antiviral. It seems to also put, say, herpes virus into remission to some degree. Again, not as good as some chemical options, but it's quite good. It's an all-rounder, has similar health benefits to metformin, of course, at higher doses, which, for most people, it's probably not necessary to be taking it, but it's helpful, and especially in this modern day and age with our sedentary lifestyle. But anyway, I digress. I'm not here to sell you resveratrol. I'm here to speculate on the possible hazards of taking a untested messenger RNA jab. So this messenger RNA most certainly interacts with G4s, and so does the spike protein. That's right. So the spike protein will interact with G4s and actually stimulate their appearance. Um, it won't um, cause any immediate effects that we know of in terms of mutations. However, G-quadruplexes are, quite honestly, that's how um, your DNA will, transpose along the genome. So along the ribbons of DNA, G-quadruplexes are responsible for stitching it together. It's also important in base excision repair. So when DNA strands get broken, this is one of the mechanisms whereby it attempts to correct the strand. Now, very often, it's fine. This happens. Every cell in your body, who knows how many times per day, will have who knows how many of these G4s doing G4 things. The problem starts where you have too many, and you've now used them to stimulate the production of a protein that stimulates the production of the G4s. Okay. Now, of course, there's limited data with regards to these things. It's not like they've put any kind of data out there. They just called it proprietary and said, no, we don't need to show you what's in the secret sauce. So what's the hazard? What's the real hazard? Well, the real hazard is about 11% of the human genome is actually identical to a type of corn fungus. Okay? It's what's called ALU elements. And surprise, surprise, these ALU elements are heavily implicated in noxious and negative mutations as well as cancers. Now, it just so happens that they typically, and this happens naturally, right, as a DNA copying error by the hands of G4s, typically. I don't want to put it all on them. There's other mechanisms at play here. But I'm sort of, we're not doing multiple years of biochemistry here. But you should look into it. Now, if you now have these spike proteins that are stimulating this G4 activity, you end up with, monkeys and typewriters. Similar thing, but now it's unregulated. In fact, because of its unnatural stimulation, I would say that it's possibly going to end up having much more deleterious effects because say you get exposed to the spike protein through a virus, it won't be expressed in all your cells. It'll be expressed in some, and this is one of the real reasons that I strongly believe that this virus is dangerous, but it's not immediately dangerous, not for many people. It's more of a long-term thing, and we'll get to that in a bit. So, in the case of the spike protein being ubiquitously and constantly expressed in all your cells, you run a far greater risk of these copying errors in your DNA. caused by this increase in G4 activity. And now, oddly enough, as an anecdote, it turns out that people with severe COVID, oops, I said it, people with severe COVID tended to have shorter telomere length. Okay. Now, is it that they ended up having severe COVID because they had short telomere length, or did severe COVID cause their telomeres to shorten? We don't know. There are studies being done on this, I'm sure. It's worth looking into. Now, anecdotally as well, that it's worth looking into the biological oddities of the naked mole rat. Now, one thing about the naked mole rat is that actually there's a few things, so you might want to hunker down for that one. But the naked mole rat, amongst its peculiarities, are it produces a high molecular mass hyaluronic acid. Now, what this does is it's basically a molecule that sort of gets between the cells and helps create a scaffold, typically for damaged tissues, to form either new cells or scar tissue, amongst other things. It's also, get this, involved in not the mole rat version, but the human version. It's implicated in the anthrax pathway. So, anthrax, apparently, or rather the C word, shares a lot of aspects with anthrax. Or it shares one in particular, I can't remember which. That on its own is worth looking into, because one thing that they found in people with COVID, more severe forms of COVID, was an increased amount of fragments of hyaluronic acid. And what this is it's sort of like a jelly-like substance. Yeah, you don't want that in your lungs. On mole rats, it's you could think of it as being thicker, but they also have something going on there. I'm just going to digress a bit here and go into what we see before us here. The intramolecular G-Quadruplex induces hyaluronic acid DNA superpolymers, causing cancer cell swelling, blebbing, and death. Okay. Now, what does this have to do with, well, anything? And the answer is, we'll get there. Use your thinking hats. Use your brains. So, and I mean, we're really dealing with a multi-tentacled little viral demon here. This is not a one-trick pony virus, nor is it a one-trick pony chemical process. There's a lot going on here. This is the big boy. So, G-Quadruplexes induce hyaluronic acid DNA superpolymer, causing cell death, swelling, blebbing, and death. Okay, so what else can we infer from this? Well, as it would seem, that people who have taken the vaccine, because by the way, for some reason, people like to inject it in their face. Hyaluronic acid, rather. It's used as a filler. It's a cosmetic. Things people do for likes. So, people who inject this HA as a cosmetic filler, um, it can occur, it can happen that, and this is, obviously this becomes statistically relevant, um, is that they end up with, pretty severe swelling in their face. I don't know about that, but okay. So back to the naked mole rats for a second. The naked mole rat, in its wide toolbox of, you know, super aging and cancer avoidance, um, because it is quite remarkable that the naked mole rat lives to be something absurd within the rodent family. Now, don't quote me, but I'm pretty sure it's something like 38 years or something. Um, Whereas if anybody's ever owned a hamster, then after 6 months you start planning for its funeral. Um, so the naked mole rat, even if it's 12 years, it's still a long time for a rodent. But either way, it's the longest lived rodent by a long margin. And one of the things that it can do is it doesn't need so much oxygen, which you would assume so, that they would evolve to require maybe less oxygen, live more Spartan underground, and to be friendly with one another. But one thing in their cellular mechanism that allows them to avoid cancer and death and senile cells is they will actually their G-Quadruplex system, if you want to call it that, is a lot more on guard. So what's really curious is the lack of correlation between some of the symptoms that people are reporting, both in the virus and in the side effects of the vaccine. I would say, normally people are saying things like, inflammation, fluid retention, which to me, okay, this could be an immune response. It could be, but what kind? It's a bit odd. We're not seeing typical white blood cell, your typical cytokine storm. Um, Now, some people, and don't get me wrong, the immediate side effects when they show up, they're quite rare. The more common side effects are nausea, headache, that type of thing. Nothing too severe. Lethargy, which we'll get to the lethargic aspect later. Um, but these things don't correlate. It's not normal that in some people their heart stops, in some people their skin falls off. I have a difficult time understanding why the two things are related, right? But then it becomes screamingly obvious that it's happening within the cell, and it has to do with improper um, function of these G4s. They're not doing what they're supposed to do anymore, not properly in most people. Now, I would assume that even in people who have been vaccinated, I'm going to stop saying vaccinated, and I'm going to go to using the term inoculated. To the people who've been exposed, I think that's a fitting one. To the people who've been exposed, what you're really dealing with here is your body, and your cells have all this machinery to help regulate these G4s. It regulates your DNA, it regulates your RNA. You have, an untold amount of DNA breaks that happen, mutations that occur in your DNA every day, every hour, every minute. It's it's pretty large math. It's large scale math. I mean, we're talking about millions and millions, and how many cells do you have in your body? I don't care to remember that number, but I remember the figure is something in the neighborhood of, I don't know, maybe trillions. So, and your cells get turned over every few hours, every few days. You know, in some rare cases, there's some rare cells that they'll stick around for a few more, maybe a week or two. But yeah, generally speaking, I mean, your body can take care of itself unless it's been told to take care of itself differently, and in doing so, it interferes with its ability to take care of itself. That's where the risk is, such as the spike protein, which, yeah, we've seen that the spike protein can cause cellular damage, and they don't know why it does. Um, it doesn't seem to be that the spike protein itself can physically damage the cell. Um, but, you know, what seems to be happening is that the spike protein basically starts pulling all the levers on these G4s and dysregulates them. And then the cells in question, um, because they're dysregulated, they become, senescent. They're, the cell metabolism is dysregulated, so it's, it's like a chain falling off a bike. Um, and because of this, that's where you end up with tissue damage. Is you've got too many cells that are basically, you know, they're turning bad. They need to be replaced, which seems to also correlate with the shortened telomere thing. Um, yeah. So amongst other things, stress granule formation by coronavirus endoribonuclease NSP15 ensures efficient virus replication. Hmm. Okay. Interesting. It's a really interesting article that I have here, which highlights the viral replication as well as the RHAU, which RNA helicase associated with AU rich element. So gold. I believe it's actually monatomic gold, um, which does bring me back to something. Just had an idea. Yeah. So here, previous work showed that RHAU associates with mRNAs and relocalizes to stress granules upon translational arrest induced by various environmental stresses. A region, the first 105 amino acids, was shown to be critical for RNA binding and relocalization to SGs. Which, oh yeah, hold on. RHAU exhibits a unique ATP dependent. Remember what I said about lethargy? Guanine quadruplex resolvase activity for specificity and specificity for its substrate in vitro. RHAU binds G4 nucleic acid with sub-nanomolar affinity and unwinds G4 structures much more efficiently than double-stranded nucleic acid, also known as DNA. Consistent with these biochemical observations, RHAU was also identified as a major source for tetramolecular RNA resolving activity and helocell lysates. Interesting. Interesting. Okay. So we're getting close. We're getting close to the case, whatever the case may be. Now, back to it. Now, it would also seem that, yes, the G-quadruplex DNA structure resolvase, RHAU, is essential for spermatogonia differentiation. Spermatogonia? Spermatogonia. Wow. So what does this mean? Male reproduction. And I think that's a pretty important one. It's a pretty important one. And to nobody's surprise, it's also extremely important in the case of female reproduction as well. So now, so many moving parts. I'm not sure where we are, but suffice to say that the virus is bad, dangerous, especially if it really has a potent and lasting effect, which in many cases it seems to have. But if the mRNA jab basically does the same thing, but just makes sure that it all happens, how is that even a thing? So we can assume that it's basically like having COVID, but with no immune response to it. And certain elements refined out. Now, don't quote me on that, but, that seems to be the case, to me at least. We will see in the next few months, we will see all sorts of endogenous retroviruses coming to life. One of the things, actually, this is another one, is that apparently people who have herpes, dormant cold sores and herpes, those reactivate, which, yeah, and apparently that's a big problem. I think it was an Israeli study where this came out. So, yeah, I guess we're really over the target here. The question is, what can we do about it? Well, for one, we can request to know what the intended consequence of the jabs are, because what I find is of particular interest is that they say you can mix and match the jabs, which for the life of me I don't understand how that's supposed to be a thing, right? You're not supposed to be able to mix and match. If you do that, then, well, that's not supposed to work. That doesn't make sense. But okay. It's you could just mix and match random genetic modifications and okay, suit yourself. Now, don't get me wrong. I do believe in the potential for mRNA therapeutics. And it's possible that they could be beneficial and very helpful in the healthcare field, where you can target a gene and disable it or enable it, much like CRISPR, but better, because this is
You're just really disabling it and maybe not deleting it, um, which is, for somebody who's got multiple sclerosis, or what else, this could be very beneficial. The only difference is that in these cases, what you're doing is you're disabling a specific gene, or maybe you may have found the golden ticket in another gene and you want to enable it. Okay, it's fairly straightforward, but you're not producing an exogenous protein that's dangerous to the system you're using. Sorry. Sorry if I can't face the absurdity with a straight face. That's that's not for me. I won't be taking this job. I won't be taking the science juice. It's absurd. So, what are we looking at potentially? And I don't want to be the person who's screaming the sky's falling. I really don't. But what are the potential outcomes in terms of negative side effects? Well, you see the immediate negative side effects. We've seen them. We're familiar with them. They're they can be pretty extreme, but for the most part, most people don't suffer from these side effects. So, in terms of acute reactions, they're pretty few. Um, they can be adverse, but most of the time they're quite mild. Uncomfortable, that's for sure. Um, but you have the rest of your life to live with this, which, if it's going to be doing this, if your G4 activity is going to be, unstable for the rest of your life, you're going to end up with, you know, your genome is going to be completely mismatched. By that, I mean it's going to be a Rubik's cube of, you know, 80 billion parts. Um, Compared to mRNA therapeutics of a more traditional nature, you could think of it as cutting an apple in two. And if ever there's a problem, you could just put the two parts back together. No big deal, because it's straightforward. It's a single gene, maybe a couple of genes. You're not you're not throwing an apple in a blender and then trying to undo it. Uh, so lethargy. The lethargy stems from G4 guanine quadruplex. Okay, and so in anaerobic metabolism, that means without oxygen, you have GDP and GTP, so guanine diphosphate, guanine triphosphate, and they will work their magic with phosphocreatine and other substances to create energy within the cell without any oxygen. So typically, aerobic metabolism um, is your body will take carbs, sugars, and create ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And on occasion, it'll do adenosine diphosphate. Um, and this is really the fuel of your cell. You know, when people talk about blood sugar, it's like, okay, yeah, it's not really that you have low blood sugar or high blood sugar. Actually, that's not true. In the case of high blood sugar, you may actually have sugar in your blood, which is not good. In the case of low blood sugar, um, yeah, it's the ATP. You need the ATP, right? And your body will convert um, GDP to ATP, or ATP to GTP, then back to GDP, whatever. It's cyclical. Your body does some stuff. Your cells, more specifically, will do that. Now, G4s are implicated in this. Okay. So you have poor, and this is something that's been noted in a lot of C word patients, is poor anaerobic metabolism. There seems to be something that's stopping the metabolism of GDP and GTP. Um, which is of pretty great concern because you're dealing with a respiratory ailment. So if you run out of breath, you're really up shit's creek as compared to something else where, normally you run out of breath, you catch your breath, but if you run out of breath, you die. It's pretty severe. Or rather than death, you end up with cell death, which, especially for the brain, will result in. So you end up with organ damage, failure, necrosis. Could be what we're seeing with people with diabetes as well. Why it seems to be so dangerous for people who are diabetic, but also the neuropathies and the diabetic neuropathies. So like people's toes falling off, things like that. That might have to do with poor oxygenation. But just imagine in the next, who knows how long, if this can be a symptom, if a side effect of the jabs, that your anaerobic metabolism will no longer be what it used to be. Okay. And what about your insulin response? So the same. Okay. So what about your immune system? Oh, it's going to be defective. In fact, you may have autoimmune disorders. Okay. And what about Lewy body dementia? What about, amyloid beta plaques? So Alzheimer's and the various other, neurodegenerative diseases. Yeah, you might get those too. They may occur down the road, of course. And cancers? Well, I mean, if half your body mass is a benign tumor, is it all that bad? I guess it's only that bad if the other half is a malignant tumor, which will probably be the case for some people. Now, wholesale, we're not talking about if, we're talking about how many and what's the likelihood. So that's a game of statistics that's sort of outside of my present field of understanding. Um, People's genes are unique. People's responses to certain things are pretty unique. So I would not be surprised if that were the case. If somebody told me 5% of the population, I'd go, yeah, okay. If somebody told me 60% of the population in 10 years will have one of the following things that I just mentioned, yeah, probably, maybe, I don't know. I haven't done the math on that. It's quite heavy. There's a lot of moving parts, a lot of dependent variables. But, perfect example is SV40, simian virus 40, which was in the polio vaccine. It's related to HIV. They say that it does nothing in the human biome, but it turns out that it does. And a lot of people have implicated it in all kinds of just general malaise, health problems, asthmas. So the whole list of, and this reactivates SV40? Fuck off, I don't want that shit. So you're gonna end up, and by you, it's not a certain thing, but the risks are, I'll leave it there. The risks are that you may have permanent blindness, deafness, your GPCRs or G-coupled protein receptors, um, GCPRs, will be non-functioning. In fact, you may even have an autoimmune response to them, which are, more specifically the rhodopsin-like receptors, which are, they're guanine coupled protein receptors. So again, guanine. So rhodopsin, oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin, your olfactory receptors, sense of smell. Yeah, that's one. Vasopressin, various other angiotensin, angiotensin 2. Those are also rhodopsin-like GCPRs. So again, we're over the target because I just listed all the possible routes of entry that they've so far listed. So you risk that sort of, anything within the rhodopsin like receptor family. That's possibly dangerous. Now, in terms of that occurring, I want to think that the possibility is minute. It's there, but it's not really the greatest threat. Which, in the case of the next 5 to 10 years, even maybe even sooner than 5 years, is you're going to have a huge amount of the population who's going to become diabetic, brain damaged, possibly, cancers, infertile is, fertility, we're dealing with, this is actually like really a big one, is the fertility aspect, both female and male reproduction. Huge problem with that. Also hormonal imbalances in general, which also will include insulin. Everybody's going to be sick, and nothing too specific at any given time. When they go to the doctor is not going to say, hey, you're infertile, but, oh, you only have 3 sperm. Technically, you still have sperm. Oh, your eggs are there, but they're kind of, oh, the DNA in them is all fucked up. You're gonna give birth to corn yeast. Cancer is going to be a big one, mostly because of those ALU elements, and the oncoviruses and the endogenous retroviruses. So it's kind of gross. Just the amount of autoimmune things. You're going to have all kinds of reactions. People with new allergies, which is pretty typical with vaccines. Actually, there's a correlation with vaccinations and allergies. Now, does that mean you shouldn't get vaccinated for polio? Absolutely not. Get your polio vaccine. Make sure it's a good one, a clean one, because SV40 is some real shit. But yeah, is it free? It's open speculation that any of these things can happen to people who've been exposed to the mRNA therapeutic. It's both possible and, some degree, parts of it are inevitable. You're also going to have lazy mitochondria. Anybody who knows what that is does not want it. And also, another thing is that they didn't do any generational studies. See, normally when you want to get a drug released, you have to do generational studies, right? To see what will this drug do to pregnant mice? What will this drug do to mice in general? And what will this drug do after a generation? So they look at the new pups, they look at the mice, they say, okay, is everything okay? Okay, so they are either fine or not. And they do this for several generations. And sometimes, depending on the type of study, they'll have, they test on a lot of mice for every drug, rabbits, etc. And so the idea is that usually after 5 generations, you're in the clear. Okay. But here we are, they haven't done any generational studies. And there runs an even greater risk that there won't be any generational studies. Because while we all understand that it takes a sperm and an egg to create a new generation, it just might be that the embryogenesis won't even occur. So not only do you have no eggs and no sperm, you have no embryos being formed. Might be worth looking into. It's not worth getting sensational about. That'll get us nowhere. That'll get you nowhere. That'll get me nowhere. But it's a possibility. Now, is everything going to happen to everybody at the max volume? No, I don't believe so. But will this be an omnipresent scarring of the human genome? Yeah. Yeah, it would. So for me, more than any mRNA or virus, I'm actually more concerned by the societal implications. What would it be honestly, I don't even want to think about that. But it is what it is. No, it's stunning. I mean, they took, what was it, 1 day to produce the vaccine. So they say. I don't know how true that is. And there's always the risk that these new variant mutation viruses are just going to circumvent the vaccine anyway. It's always a possibility. It's not a fool's errand to speculate. Of course, it all depends. Either it will or it won't, and it all depends on chemistry. So without models, without protein folding, you'll never really know. But conceivably, it could occur, yeah. So yeah, I guess. Oh, and then there's the other aspect, the viral shedding and the vaccine shedding. It actually says it in their, at least I think it's Pfizer, their the documentation that goes with the mRNA jab is that if you've been vaccinated or something, you can't come in contact with anybody. It's really there. It really is in their documentation. That even if you haven't been vaccinated, but you vaccinate others, you can't go home and touch your spouse